And today in this HIDA lecture, I will dive into the issue of hate speech. And as you've heard already, I'm not a data scientist myself. I'm an ethicist. I have a professorship for ethics and applied ethics. And as an applied ethicist, I spent most of my time on thinking about ethical problems related to technologies and, among other things, about big data and AI. Well, you may think, well, that's an easy thing. Everyone thinks that hate speech is bad and that we should, well, try to get rid of it. But I think there's more to say about this, and we should try to analyze it a little bit more carefully, and in particular, see what challenges are involved when we try to identify and to combat hate speech, in particular, when it comes to using methods of big data and AI. So this is what I will focus on. What are the challenges if we use AI technology to combat hate speech? Okay, so this is what I will present you today. And as I've said before, there will be room, hopefully, for Q&A at the end. As philosophers, we typically start with getting our concepts clear. And this is actually what we spend most of our time on. But so when we talk about hate speech, the first thing we should do is to think about what is it exactly? What is this kind of a phenomenon that we call hate speech? And when I prepared this talk, I looked at various institutions and, well, sites that provide working definitions, let's say. And here's one that I found helpful. So I see a raised hand. How do we deal with this? Shall we, is there any policy on this? Shall we start, shall we wait until the end, or shall we have it directly?
Bert, you can do as you prefer, but I would suggest to put the questions to the end to give you now the floor.
And so to be sure, I saw your hand, but let's do it this way as they suggest. And let's postpone it a bit. So hate speech. This is one working definition that I found helpful, and this comes from the Council of Europe. You may know this. This is not a European Commission thing, but the Council of Europe is a different institution, and the primary focus is human rights and dealing with human rights. And they have something, they say something about what hate speech is. And here I have a quote for you. They say, oh, now I must remove this. Okay, so here's what they say. Hate speech covers many forms of expressions which advocate, incite, promote, or justify hatred, violence, and discrimination against a person or group of persons for a variety of reasons. It poses grave dangers for the cohesion of a democratic society, the protection of human rights, and the rule of law. If left unaddressed, it can lead to acts of violence and conflict on a wider scale. In this sense, hate speech is an extreme form of intolerance which contributes to hate crime. So this is, well, gives us some understanding what hate speech is. One interesting fact is that it is against a person or a group of persons. It's somehow often at least group related. And it's the important thing is that it can go on a wider scale. It can become, let's say, not only addressing a very local phenomenon, but it can become big in a sense. And we all know this. And by this, it can harm not only individual people, but whole societies. And this is what it makes so toxic, if you want. And this is, of course, not the only, but a primary reason why we are so concerned about it. So, well, let's look at another one. Here, this one is from an NGO that is trying to help people who are suffering from hate speech. It's called Hate Aid. And they have, again, kind of a working definition. They say, hate speech is a generic term for group-related misanthropy expressed verbally or in writing. This includes racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism. Hate speech includes insults, calls for violence, threats, and other statements, regardless of whether they are punishable by law or not. However, the term hate speech is not clearly defined and is sometimes also used to refer to general hate on the internet. And now you see, actually, it becomes immediately tricky when we think about it. They limit it to group-related forms of insults, right? The Council of Europe was a bit more liberal, say it can affect individual people, it can also affect groups. Here, they limited themselves to group-related misanthropy. I want to leave this open for the moment. I don't think that it is super important for my thoughts and for my reflections, whether we think of hate speech only addressing or only located on a group-related level, or also covering individual forms of insults or so. Another thing is interesting here in this definition by Hate Aid. They say it's regardless of whether they are punishable by law or not. So in a sense, we are very often concerned with gray areas, right? So, and this immediately calls for ethical reflections, for balancing, for trade-offs. And we will see this in a couple of minutes, that we, well, need to find very often trade-offs and balances when dealing with hate speech and when thinking about how, what to do about it. Okay, so now I hope we are all on the same page. We are talking about this kind of problem. So how should we analyze it in terms of ethics? And for this, let me step back and say something about how ethicists often work. We think about what are the most important concepts to frame a problem. And for this, we typically use a couple of very fundamental basic ethical principles that almost everyone agrees on, that they are ethical principles. And one set of ethical principles has been suggested by Tom Beecham and James Childress, actually already in the late 70s. And here you see them. They say, well, at least very important ethical principles are the principle of autonomy, the principle of non-maleficence, the principle of beneficence, and the principle of justice. So when we think about particular problems, those four principles can help us getting clear what the ethical problems actually are. When they introduced this set of principles, well, of course, they picked it up from the ethical tradition, but their primary target was biomedical research. This comes from a book called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. But it turns out that these are actually useful principles for a whole variety of issues. So when we think about what the ethical problems of any particular thing, let's say hate speech, are, it's a good starting point to take these four principles and to think whether they can help us to see clearer what the problems really are. And this is what I've at least done when I prepared this talk. So typically not all four principles are equally important when it comes to specific problems. So sometimes the principle of justice is primary. In other situations, other principles are more important. And when I think when we think about hate speech and how to deal with it, or actually when we think about what the real ethical problem about hate speech is, it's these two principles, autonomy and non-maleficence, that take center stage. So these are the important ones. I don't want to say that the others don't play any role, but to me it seems that autonomy and non-maleficence are the primary ones. And the next step typically then is to think, how can we make them more concrete given the concrete at hand. So these principles are located on a fairly abstract level. So now the next step is what in particular, what kind of autonomy, if you want, is relevant here. And well, that's not super difficult to say, I guess. When it comes to freedom, to hate speech, the one principle that is definitely on the table is freedom of speech. And the other one is the integrity of the person. So, well, probably everyone is familiar with them, but let me just quickly say what I mean by this. Freedom of speech means everyone is entitled to say whatever he or she wants, unless there are good reasons to restrict this freedom. So none of these principles holds absolutely. There are always good reasons to limit them in one or the other case. It only says we need good reasons for this. So as a starting point, freedom of speech is something important, and whenever we limit the freedom of speech of an individual person, we need good ethical reasons. And the same holds, of course, true for the other principle, integrity of person. So that means basically that the psychophysical integrity of a person shouldn't be touched, shouldn't be damaged. So we shouldn't cause harm, neither physical nor psychological harm to people. Again, unless we have good reasons. Sometimes there are good reasons to violate the psychophysical integrity, but yeah, we need to justify it. So these are the two principles we have, and well, apparently they can come into conflict, and actually they very often do, and this is the case also when it comes to hate speech. Well, people are free to say whatever they want. That's covered by the freedom of speech and in the background by the principle of autonomy, which is a basic principle. At the same time, some forms of utterances can harm people. That's just the idea about hate speech. And therefore, the principle of the integrity of the person may be violated. So what we need to find trade-offs between these two principles. So we need to carefully evaluate what is more important, the freedom of speech, the integrity of the person. How do we limit the one, or are we okay with certain kinds of harms? That's the basic ethical principle, or the basic ethical question when it comes to hate speech. So this is how I would frame the ethical problem when it comes to hate speech. Okay. Next, now we have our tools in place. Next, we need to take a closer look on the phenomenon again. So I started with conceptual considerations what hate speech is. Now I think if we look at the sources of hate speech, we need to make a differentiation. We need to separate two different areas because they raise different problems. The one is hate speech on social media, and the other one is hate speech caused or originated in large language models. So I will think about both cases in turn, and I will start with social media. Okay, so that's the more familiar case. So social media, as probably everyone knows, can encourage the radicalization of opinions and lead to rapid and often uncontrolled dissemination. The source of hate speech is, and this is important, always a person who is responsible for the action. So when it comes to hate speech on social media, it's always a person posting a video, a picture, a post, whatsoever. So in theory, at least, we can identify the person who did it. Might be difficult, but we can do so. And then we need to think about whether whatever he or she did, whatever he or she posted, is it still covered by the freedom of speech? Or should we say, well, it's so aggressive, it's so hateful, we want to stop the person, and even maybe we think it's a crime, right? Possible countermeasures include monitoring social media, deleting posts, sanctioning authors and platforms operators. We have laws now in place, at least at the EU, the Network Enforcement Act, that is especially concerned with this. And the trade-off here, or the problem of the balancing, is the risk of censorship, right? So, of course, it's a good thing to prevent persons from suffering from hate speech, but we shouldn't overdo it. Otherwise, we run into the problem of censorship. And this is exactly the trade-offs that we need to find. And we're pretty good in doing this, actually. We're doing ethical trade-offs, ethical balancing all the time. That's not something particularly new. Well, that's quite familiar. The problem here is at a different level. The problem is that the sheer amount of posts we're dealing with makes it necessary that we use technologies to identify hate speech. So it's not feasible that we look manually, that persons look manually at each and every single case and make a trade-off between the freedom of speech and the integrity of persons, or the non-maleficence principle. But the sheer amount of posts makes it necessary that we employ technologies. And now, of course, big data and AI enters the picture. And I just picked one of the big platforms. It could have been any, but I picked YouTube, and I found some interesting numbers. Today already, YouTube themselves, or Google, or Alphabet, whoever's behind it, says 95% of the content that is removed from the platform today is removed automatically. So you see numbers are from 23, but I guess it's still the same. So already today, the vast majority of stuff that is being removed is not removed manually. So the trade-offs I was talking about before are not done manually, but are implemented in a technology already, right? Just to make this, to come quickly to the other number, it's interesting. Hate speech actually is only a minor share. The majority of content removed from YouTube is removed due to other reasons. The only, probably it's small and it's in German, the blue part here, almost 37%, is protection of children. So stuff is being removed because it could be bad for children. So it's not, hate speech is only 2.3%. So it's not a very big share of the stuff that is being removed. But anyway, so you see 95% of the content of YouTube is removed not by persons looking at the stuff, but automatically, and 2.3% of this is due to the content being hateful. Okay, so what is now the problem? The problem is that if we implement these trade-offs, these ethical balancings into a technology, well, that might easily becomes either too loose or too restrictive. And on the one side, it's working fine, and I found a relatively recent paper saying here, you see, it's computationally efficient and it can account for the context in which a post is placed. However, it's really difficult to find exact balancings. And I give you an example which you may be familiar with, where this is super apparent, super clear. And here it is. So you probably know the cartoon, that's Winnie the Pooh. Oh, well, that's not super hateful, I would say, but it's deleted automatically when you're in China because it's seen as an undue criticism of Xi Jinping, right? So we probably think that's going too far to the side of censorship, at least I would argue so. And this is the whole problem of making it automatically, right? So it doesn't allow for these fine individual nuances and these individual trade-offs we typically do in ethics. We have to be bold when we use these technologies. And well, then it's difficult to find fair and just trade-offs. On the other side, as I said before, there's no way of getting back and doing it manually. It's given the sheer amount of posts, that's impossible. So that is the one problem that we have to face when we think about how to deal with hate speech. And here, at least I have some colleagues arguing at the same in the same direction. Here's one paper that I found from Natalie Alcibiadu, I guess. It's on artificial intelligence and online hate speech moderation. And she says, well, we have to be careful if we use heavy automation because we may overdo it. We may run the risk of not finding these justified trade-offs. And what is even more, even if we agree that this is the way to go, our models for identifying hate speech, as you all know, are only as good as the training data is. That's a very common problem in AI. And here she says, biased training data sets, the lack of relevant data and the lack of conceptualizations of context and nuance can lead to wrong decisions. I don't have a fixed solution for this, right? I only want to highlight the problem. On the one side, I fully agree we need to use automation and we need to use AI technology to identify and to remove hate speech from the internet. On the other side, we may run the risk of overdoing it. And probably the best thing we can do is to have processes that allows to complain, right? If your content has been removed and you think, well, that was a fair criticism, that was not hate speech, then you should have one or the other way to do so. Okay, so let me come now to the second part, right? Large language models. Here, the situation is different. Large language models generate text on the basis of very large amounts of data. You all know this, of course, and can produce the distortions contained therein. So here, the origin of hate speech is not a single person, not someone who wants to, wants to criticize or wants to insult someone, but here it's simply in our old text data, in the training data where the large language model was trained on. And there are plenty of examples for large language models giving output that falls, at least broadly, under the category of hate speech. And again, everyone is aware of this, and countermeasures are starting to get in place. The new AI Act has a section on large language models. Here, the trade-off is different. It's not that we run the risk of putting too strong limitations on the freedom of speech on a single person. Here, if we are too restrictive, the problem is rather that innovation is being hindered. No? So if we are too restrictive in the sense that we put strong limitations on large language models, one problem is, well, that these models cannot be developed as easily and as good as we may want to. Okay, but there are other problems. So if, again, here in this case, we could try to use AI itself to countermeasure the output, and this is, of course, being done already. Here, one problem is that in order to come up with an AI that is working as a countermeasure on the LLM, you need first to train this model. And as the Time magazine has reported, and I show you here the part of this article, it's apparently the case that the company OpenAI exploited people in Kenya for going through content that is hateful, full of violence, to label it, to build a model to counteract hateful output by LLMs. And this, of course, causes a lot of ethical problems on its own. So that's another dimension we have to be clear in order to have automated processes for identifying hate speech. Well, that's not a very attractive job, apart from the fact that it's badly paid. But even if it would be better paid, it's still something probably none of us would very much like to do, going through all this stuff and to label it to have at the end a model that can counteract an LLM. So these are some of the problems we're dealing with when we think about hate speech and how to use big data and AI models, well, to get a hold on it. And that's basically what I wanted to present you. So let's wrap up. Okay. So freedom of speech is a central ethical principle and enjoys a high level of protection in democratic states. So that was one of my starting points, and I think probably everyone agrees. At the same time, the integrity of the person is an equally central ethical principle and enjoys a similarly high level of protection. So these are the two principles that do play a role here, and what we need is finding balances. In case of conflict in principles, well-founded trade-offs must be found, which often requires a case-by-case assessment. This is something I want to stress again. We need to find case-by-case assessments, and given our ethical practice, we're good in this. But technological solutions are needed because we cannot do it on a case-by-case basis. The numbers are simply too high. And this brings this problem that a case-by-case assessment is difficult when we have a technology in place. Okay, what else? Fundamental rights are linked to the ability to take responsibility for one's own action. This refers to the social media case here. It's individual persons, and we have to identify them, and they can say, well, I think what I've done is covered by the freedom of speech, or not, and we may agree or disagree. In that case, it's a person who is accountable. That's different in the case of large language models. Here, it's much more difficult. It's contained in the training data, and it's not simply the case that we can pinpoint one person who is responsible. At the end of the day, I think technology-based solutions are needed for support, again, because of the sheer amount we're dealing with. But hopefully, as I made clear, full automation has its problem. So one last take-home message from my side probably is, apart from technology-based solutions, the fight against hate speech must also be embedded in programs for strengthening democracy and media literacy. It's not enough that we come up with smart technology solutions. We definitely need them, but it's not enough. We need people that are sensitive to this stuff and who simply reject looking at it. Then that's also, I think, part of the solution. Well, that's it from my side. Thanks for listening. And now we have time for Q&A.